Hi everybody, and welcome to the channel. And here is some more James Bond trivia. This time for your eyes only. This is the only Bond movie to date in the official franchise not to feature M. It was the first Bond movie not to feature Bernard Lee as M. We played the role in previous 11 movies in the franchise. Lee died of stomach cancer on January the 16th, 1981, after filming of this movie had started. Before his scene was shot, although was dying of stomach cancer, he did try to film at least one scene in the movie, but in the end it was too much for him. He had to bow out. He died not long after. As a result, Q's role in this movie was slightly to fill the gap. As such, several scenes were originally intended to include M were rewritten with Q. For example, the confession scene as a mark of respect. A line in the dialogue had to be cut from the opening helicopter sequence for legal reasons. The bald man could not be called Blofeld, as Kevin McCoy had won a cold case several years previously and owned the rights to use of Spectre and Ernst Stavro Blofeld. Unofficially disposing of Blofeld so early in the movie was Howard R. Broccoli's way of telling McCoy that the success of the 007 did not depend on him, and he got rid of Blofeld supposedly once and for all. The stunt of Bond falling off the cliff was so dangerous since the sudden rope jerk at the bottom could be fatal. Derek Minings developed a system that could temper to stop, but Rick Sylvester recalled that his nerves nearly got the better of him. From where we were, you could see the local cemetery, and the box at the top of my looked like a casket. Begging Bond to spare his life, Blofeld baffles viewers with a cryptic line, "I'll buy you a delicatessen in stainless steel." It's reported that a phrase is that the producer Albert R. Broccoli will record accounts of 1930s New York mafia gangsters. Sir Roger Moore's vertigo made the rock face climbing impossible. He had to do. Moore has said that he took a sim amount of Valium and a drink a tall glass of beer. Scary climbing sequence which helped him through the close-up shots. Stuntman Rick Sylvester performed most of the work. Moore only had to dangle a 4-foot drop, while Sylvester dangled over a 20-foot drop. The epitaph in the opening scene of Bond's wife's tombstone is, "We have all the time in the world. The last words on Her Majesty's Secret Service." To enter the identity booth, Q enters 5 digits of a 7-digit code. These 5 digits were first nods to the chorus of "Nobody Does It Better." When Bond and Marina are dragged along the boat, the camera were operating at a reported speed of 27 per second and then played back at 24 frames per second. The reasons of the underwater close-ups of Caroline Bridget had to be faked was that she had sinus trouble and made it impossible for divers to remain underwater. Maurice Bender decided to include Sheena Easton to the title sequence because before looking and meeting her in person, he told producers that must have that face. However, shooting Sheena Easton in the title sequence proved to be a problem, since Bender was using a soft light focus and a very high film stock. Moonraker was a financial success, but critics commented that the film franchise had become too focused on wild gadgets and outlandish plots, over-the-top villains and screwball comedy. As a result, producers decided to return to more realistic storyline in the movie, used from Russia with Love or Her Majesty's Secret Service. A major problem occurred during production, which threatened to stop the filmmakers filming. The monks who lived in the monastery on top of the mountain placed sheets and plastic over the top of the roof and interfering with filming. They allegedly did not like the violence associated with James Bond reportedly, so Roger Moore told them he had once been a saint, and a reference to the saint in 1962. The only movie saved United from financial ruin at the time of the movie's release. The studio was still reeling from Evans Gate 1980, a notorious $40 million bomb that was about to force United Artists to file for bankruptcy. When this movie took a worldwide gross of $195 million, the studio was saved and afterwards turned its focus towards blockbusters, less on personal movies. Cassandra Harrison was at the time of filming married to future Bond actor Pierce Brosnan. Brosnan was offered the part 5 years later, but he was unable to appear as Bond in The Living Daylights. In the opening sequence, James Bond visits his deceased wife's grave at Stoke Parish Church, adjoining to golf course from Goldfinger. To pay tribute to the death of Sir Roger Moore, 2 James Bond movies, The Spy Who Loved Me and this movie, Moore's 2 favourite of his Bond movies, as well as 2 his best, were released on scheduled dates in scheduled theatre territories around the world. It was during the production that Cassandra Harrison introduced Pierce Brosnan to producer Albert R. Broccoli. Bond mentions a Chinese saying before setting out for revenge: first you dig 2 graves. This quote is indeed a Chinese and absolute Chinese philosopher. The closing scene, where British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher marked the first time a real-life head of government was portrayed on screen in a James Bond movie. The close-ups of Caroline Beckett and Roger Moore for the underwater scenes were filmed in slow motion, a studio with a wind fan to produce the effect of floating air. Steven Spielberg had been very much interested in directing a James Bond movie early years, Bridge of Spies, in 2015. He talked with producer Albert R. Broccoli about directing, but Broccoli told him he was only wanted British directors from the film franchise. Shortly afterwards, George Lucas offered Spielberg a hero of his own, and in the form of Indiana Jones. John Glenn stated that there had been some discussions of bringing back Jaws character for a 3rd time, but eventually the idea was rejected as he felt that it did not fit the movie's more serious tone. Charles Dance's first movie role was in Fog Inc. Claudius. In this movie, he played James Bond author Ian Fleming in GoldenEye. Although not mentioned in this movie, Sir Roger Moore said that his autobiography, the character was supposed to be only 16 years old. For the first time since On Her Majesty's Secret Service, we see Bond toss his jewellery onto the stand to Moneypenny, but Roger Moore was never seen wearing it during his time in the role. The exploding Lotus at the start of this movie was, and Bond would be fancy gadgets in this movie and he'd done the last few entries in the franchise. Topol suggested to producer Albert R. Broccoli that the first invite was Our Sorcerer to the premiere, and he did, making his first reunion between the two men since they broke up after The Man with the Golden Gun. The helicopter sequence in the pre-credit sequence involves gasworks where Stanley Kubrick converted the Vietnam city of Hanoi in 1987's Full Metal Jacket. The story involving the sinking of a ship named the St. George off the Albanian coast was inspired by international incident on April 11, 1968, when a Soviet submarine was blown up and sunk in the Pacific Ocean. This was the first Bond movie to be based on one of Ian Fleming's short stories instead of one of his novels. The reason there are several scenes in the movie lifted from Ian explains the assault on smuggler's boat and warehouse. The opening scene where Bond visits his wife Tracy's grave was written as a way to introduce the new Bond actor, thus linking the new actor's elements from previous Bond movies. Namely, Timothy Dalton was approached to take over as Bond in this movie. Dalton declined as he disliked the direction the franchise was taking at the time. Julian Glover was a candidate to play James Bond in the 60s as one of the shortlisted as possible replacements for Sean Connery, and George Lazenby prior to the role going to Sir Roger Moore. After viewing Flash Gordon, the producers at one time wanted to cast not just Topol in this movie but also Timothy Dalton as Bond, and Melina waiting for the pot for her eventually became Bond in 1986 after Sir Roger Moore retired from the franchise. Since flying an helicopter through a warehouse was thought to be too dangerous, the scene was shot using a force perspective, a similar mock-up of the built by Nin's team closer to the camera that the stunt pilot threw behind and made it seem that it was entering the warehouse. Jeremy Bullock Smithers, the guy testing Goose Gadget as a fake cast on his arm, appeared in The Spy Who Loved Me as an HMS Ranger crewman. Although an accomplished cross-country skier, Sir Roger Moore was not instinctual to do any downhill skiing. This was the first James Bond movie scripted written by regular James Bond writer Delton Richard Melbourne and Michael J. Wilson. The writing Pierce continued until License to Kill was given the first James Bond movie directed by John Glenn. Topol was injured when he hit by flying debris during the dockside action sequence. While shooting the still for the movie's main poster, photographer Morgan Kane allegedly asked the model to put her suit on backwards and it hung on too low over her legs. After the poster was released, some newspapers editors felt that there was too much buttocks shown in the poster. The third successive Bond movie where Bond's mission takes him to Italy. He wouldn't return there until Casino Royale. The movie draws its first inspiration from the real real events. First, the disappearance of a British trawler during a storm The Barents Sea, 1974. Rumours abound that the St George is actually a spy ship monitoring Soviet forces, and loss was a result of espionage mission going wrong. The movie was originally intended to introduce a new younger actor to play James Bond. In the original draft, Marina would have been 006's girlfriend and who should have been murdered in the early movie. The voice of the man in the wheelchair unofficially earns Stavro Blover one of the main tries to voice the character in the actual movie. For a while, it's believed that Sir Roger Moore would not be returning to the role of James Bond. A round of screenshots for the new Bond was held. James Bolan, Lambert Wilson, and Timothy Dalton compared to Sid Darbo, who became the Bond girl in The Living Days, played Tanya Romanoff in the screen tests. The last official Eon Productions appearance of Ernst Stavro up until the return in Spectre. According to the CD soundtracks, sleeve notes, composer John Barry could not compose the score for this movie. He could not return to the UK for taxation purposes. Later, last Eon Productions was slowly released by United Artists. They merged with MGM before the release of the next Bond movie, Octopussy. The directorial debut of John Glenn had previously worked with 3 other Bond movies as editor. Due to the movie's success, Glenn returned to the Bond movies of the 1980s. The whole movie is strongly reminiscent of the On Her Majesty's Secret Service. In both movies, Bond with a countess on a beach threatened by monks. At one point, it wasn't certain that Roger Moore would return. Actors considered in the role included Lewis Collins, David Warwick, Michael Burton, and Ian Ogilvy. Ogilvy, like Moore, spent several years playing the Saint on television, Moore in the Saint in 1962, and Ogilvy, The Return of the Saint in 1978. The third consecutive James Bond movie was used for famous themed music from another movie, The Spy Who Loved Me, used the theme from Lawrence of Arabia, while Moonraker used the theme from Magnificent Seven. Hockey jerseys in the Blowers accept replicas of the Canadians from NHL. The original plan for the production to release in 1979, the follow-up to Spy Who Loved Me, was announced as such the opening credits the movie. However, it was decided to make Moonraker instead, which delayed production of the movie for 2 years. Following the release of Moonraker, some newspapers seamlessly announced that the next James Bond movie would be called The Seawolves. The royal world premiere of this movie was held on June the 24th, 1981 at London's Odeon, Leicester Square. In early drafts of the script, the chase sequence in the snow had James Bond pursued by bad guys on snowmobiles rather than motorcycles. John Glenn said he got the idea for a remote control helicopter in the pre-credits sequence after seeing a boy playing with a remote control car at the Pinewood Studios. So Roger Moore says the famous James Bond line twice in this movie, and this was James Bond normally line was only once in a movie. Director John Glenn opted to use the local slopes of a holly tree for the chase sequence between and men driving a Peugeot 5.4s. Peter R. Hunt, who directed On Her Majesty's Secret Service, was approached to direct this movie but was occupied with Death Hunt in 1981. "12 James Bond movies in the on-production film franchise, the 5th Bond movie to star Roger Moore as James Bond. The music score and the titles of the movie was recorded at what was known at the time as the Music Centre, located in Wembley, London. The film's main movie poster received protests from feminists, as it revealed a more than new amount of flesh from a woman's legs, thighs and buttocks in the foreground. James Bond in the background, directed of a swimsuit. This is the only time Bill Cotton was involved in the music themes from a Bond film. Greece is the major setting for this movie. It wasn't for any of Your Eyes Only short stories. Cassandra Harrison's husband, Pierce Brosnan, succeeded Timothy Dalton as the 5th actor to play James Bond in GoldenEye. This movie is one of the few action thriller movies made around in the mid-90s to early 80s, used shops in Greece. The character at the start of the movie, billed as a man in a wheelchair, is unofficially Ernst Everett Blofeld, but could not be called for reasons due to Thunderball lawsuit with Kevin McClory. Following a suggestion of director John Glenn, Peter Laumert created realistic scenery instead of set pieces for which the franchise has been known. Julian Glover joined the cast as the producer felt he was stylish. Regular production designer Ken Adam did not work on this movie because he was working with Pennies from Heaven in 1981. John Glenn was editor and second unit director on several previous Bond movies. Film, a short story, novel, is a variation of the real-life espionage team for eyes only, meaning restricted viewing to certain personnel. This is the second James Bond film helmed by the first time director, in this case John Glenn. According to Julian Glover, he was in such dire financial straits before casting in the film he was considered car in his house, playing a Bond films, boosted his fortunes. Toppo convinced Albert R. Broccoli to invite his old business partner Harry Saltzman to premiere this movie as a goodwill gesture and a way to mend fences. Bob Simmons, the stuntman, as an henchman, blown out of the Lotus car explosion. Well, that's the end of my James Bond trivia for your eyes only. Like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you all again in another video.